Okay, let's just dive right into this one. It's probably one of the most famous and, let's be honest, kind of unsettling things Jesus ever said about the afterlife. This whole idea that there's no marriage in heaven. For centuries, people have really wrestled with this. I mean, does it mean love just stops? That the most important relationships that define our lives are just gone? Well, to really get the answer, you have to understand that it wasn't an answer to a sincere question. It was actually a countermove in a high-stakes intellectual ambush.
So the whole thing kicks off with this question, right? It's thrown at Jesus by a group of really powerful religious leaders. And on the surface, it sounds like a legit, though super complicated, theological puzzle. You've got this woman, and through a whole series of tragedies, she ends up married to 7 different brothers. So when everybody's resurrected, who's she married to? But here's the twist. The guys asking the question, they didn't even believe in the resurrection in the first place. This wasn't a real question. It was a trap.
Yeah, this wasn't really a question at all. It was designed from the ground up to be an unwinnable argument, a total doctrinal trap. So before we can even unpack Jesus's famous words about marriage, we've got to understand the attackers and the clever weapon they built.
Okay, so meet the Sadducees. You can think of them as the theological ultra-conservatives of their day. They were a powerful, wealthy group of priests, and their entire worldview was built on a few key denials. They were absolutely convinced there was no resurrection, no angels, and no spirits. For them, when you're dead, you're just done. The end. So, and this is crucial, their question isn't meant to understand resurrection. It's designed to make fun of it.
Now, their trap was built on a very real ancient law right out of the Torah called levirate marriage. The idea was pretty simple, really. If a man died without any kids, his brother was required by law to marry the widow. The whole point was to provide an heir for the brother who died, making sure the family name and the property stayed in the family. It was a super important social and economic safety net back then.
So what the Sadducees do is they take this law and they just push it to a completely absurd extreme. They dream up this wild scenario. A woman marries one brother. He dies childless. So she marries the next one, and he dies too. And this happens all the way through 7 brothers. Then she finally dies. Their big gotcha question, so in the resurrection, whose wife will she be, is designed to make the afterlife sound like total chaos. 7 guys fighting over one woman for all eternity. Their goal was to make the very idea of a resurrection look completely illogical and, frankly, ridiculous.
But Jesus doesn't step into their trap. He doesn't even bother playing their game or trying to solve their little riddle. Instead, he just completely changes the rules of the debate itself. And he does it with this one single, devastating sentence. This is the moment the whole encounter pivots. You are mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. See, he doesn't attack their logic. He goes right after their entire foundation. He immediately points out 2 massive errors in their whole way of thinking. First, even though they're supposed to be religious experts, they don't actually get their own holy books. And second, their idea of God is just way, way too small. They have completely underestimated what divine power can actually do. And this right here gets to the heart of their mistake. The Sadducees thought resurrection was basically just resuscitation, like being zapped back to life to continue the same old existence with all the same old rules, but Jesus corrects that entire way of thinking. He says resurrection isn't about continuation, it's about transformation. It's a completely new kind of existence. So now that he's laid that new foundation, that resurrection is all about transformation, Jesus starts to dismantle the very premise of their question. And he does it by talking about something they didn't even believe in to begin with. And here it is, the famous line, "For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." Now listen closely to those verbs, marry and given in marriage. In that culture, these were legal terms. They were about contracts. He's talking about the institution, the social contract of marriage. He's not saying love disappears or relationships don't matter. He's saying the earthly system of marriage becomes something totally new. And bringing up angels here it's a brilliant move. First, he subtly shuts them down by confirming that angels, which they denied, are real. Second, what's the most important thing about angels in this context? They don't die. So if the resurrected are like angels, that means they won't die either. And here's the kicker. If there's no more death, then the main earthly purpose of marriage, creating heirs, continuing the family line, protecting property, it isn't necessary in the same way anymore. He just used their own disbelief against them to completely tear down their argument. But he's not done yet. After taking their logic apart, he goes in for the knockout punch.
He's about to prove the resurrection using the one part of Scripture that the Sadducees had to accept as the ultimate authority, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. He takes them all the way back to the story of Moses at the burning bush, and he quotes God's own words from the book of Exodus, words spoken centuries after the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died. And he tells them to notice the tense God uses. I am, not I was their God. And then he delivers the final inescapable conclusion. If God says in the present tense, I am their God, then they have to be alive now for God to be their God. Therefore, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Using their own book, he proves that the patriarchs are still alive in some way, which proves there is life after death. The trap is sprung, but it turns out the Sadducees are the ones caught inside it. So you see, this was so much more than just a clever debate. In taking apart their trap, Jesus gives us this incredible revelation about what eternity is actually like, and he shifts the whole conversation from a legal puzzle to a divine promise. It really reveals these 2 totally different ways of thinking that were clashing. The Sadducees had this horizontal view. Heaven is just earth, but longer. Just an extension of our current systems, our contracts, and our problems. But Jesus reveals a vertical reality. Heaven is the transformation of our world. They were arguing based on the limits of human laws. He was arguing from the limitless power of God to make everything new. So what's the bottom line here? First, the real argument was never actually about marriage. It was always about whether or not resurrection is real. Second, resurrection means a total transformation, not just a patch-up of our old lives. Third, earthly things like marriage change because the thing that makes them necessary here, death, is gone. And finally, and this gets back to that fear we started with, our identities and our deepest relationships are not erased. The idea is that they're purified and made perfect. I mean, just look at the total reversal that happened. The Sadducees came in with this tiny legal dilemma, and their whole goal was to make resurrection look ridiculous. They walked away after Jesus used their own methods against them, exposed a massive flaw in their thinking, and in the process made the resurrection look absolutely unstoppable. So, in the end, Jesus' answer wasn't really a no to love in the afterlife. It was a huge yes to something so much bigger, so much truer and more real than the Sadducees could have ever imagined. Which kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. If heaven isn't just an extension of earth with all its contracts and limits, then what is it the fulfillment of?